Dead Cells is one of Steam's most popular roguelikes and one of the few games on the platform with overwhelmingly positive reviews. But as someone who has never particularly enjoyed the roguelike genre, I haven't touched it until now. I did a blind run, I have some thoughts, so let's get into it. When considering how to make this video for a roguelike, I was confronted with a unique challenge since I'm not even sure where to start with this one. Roguelikes are in essence a series of rinsing and repeating, so it's not like there's any particular run that I could point to, since the whole thing revolved around me doing the same stuff on repeat. There's also so many different items in this game that I couldn't talk about them all, as this video would be too long. So we're going to break this video down the only way I can think to do so. We'll start with my general impressions of the game and overview of what it is, and then discuss each of the different zones you can visit during a run. To be clear, I am not including any of the DLC content in this video. As I mentioned earlier, I don't particularly enjoy roguelike genre, so forgive me if some of the points that I find interesting or unique actually aren't at all. For all intents and purposes, I'm approaching this game as somebody who has never truly played a roguelike before, with one exception I'll mention later. Overall, I think this game was put together in a rather interesting way. Starting a run is fluid and doesn't require any sort of loading screen, which led me to accidentally starting runs every once in a while because I forgot the door next to the items was the first level. But this meant I could jump right into a run immediately upon the previous one ending, which I think is great. There are portals throughout the map that make getting around more convenient, as the sprawling hallways and chambers can be a bit of a labyrinth at times, so having these portals is incredibly handy. I think they're especially useful because I was never certain when the next level's door would appear, and so if I found one early, then I'd have the option to quickly go back and explore some more. On a similar note though, comes a complaint. On the end of most levels, there's two doors that can be unlocked. One for completing the level under a certain amount of time, and another for killing a certain number of enemies without being hit. I almost never open the door for speed while in the first level in particular, because there was at least one DLC door, perhaps even more, that I kept mistaking for doors I could actually use. This meant I burnt time going down hallways just to reach an exit that'd be locked behind a paywall. I really wish they had blocked off paths to these doors entirely so my precious time wasn't wasted on content I haven't purchased. Speaking of those doors you unlock, or perhaps I could call them challenges, they definitely added a lot more to the game. Whenever I was playing a level, the objective was almost never to survive, but to avoid getting hit so well that I could get enough kills to open the monster killer door. Because I spent my time killing enemies, I almost never got the speed running one, but every here and there I'd unlock that one on accident after having found a proper door faster than intended. I found these challenges a little weird at the same time. The one for killing enemies encourages you to explore more so you can ensure you get enough kills, and if you lose your streak, you might do even more exploring in an attempt to recover the challenge. This exploring meant I'd collect more money, find more loot, and get more upgrades, this making me much stronger. Speedrunning, on the other hand, meant I ignored everything and thus got nothing. You didn't necessarily have to ignore every upgrade, but I have a hard time imagining you could get very strong while doing this. You are at least rewarded with one item for speedrunning along with some gold and souls, but the monster killing challenge does this too. Because of this, I never wanted to do the speedrunning one because I knew I wouldn't be strong enough to survive the later levels. Perhaps the time door is meant for those who are particularly good at the game, I don't know, but I found this fact a bit odd. Upgrades are something I found to be one of the most necessary things to acquire during any given run in Dead Cells. With these upgrades, you can, well, upgrade one of your three builds, let's say, choosing between brutality, tactics, and survival. Each of them will give you an increase in health and increased damage to any weapon or equipment with a corresponding color. This means if you start building one color, weapons and tools of other colors become next to useless. Sure, something is better than nothing, and some of them, like the freezing bombs, can be handy for any build, but I often found myself avoiding some of the game's variety because the color didn't match. I could always build a different color, but the build was heavily reliant on what I found in the starting room. What made it worse was that green in particular was always just a shield in the starting room, and I don't think parrying nonstop is that fun. So although I loved many green's weapons and abilities, I often didn't use it because I could rarely start with a good green weapon. But also red was heavily focused on damage and attack. Well, I need that. So I built out red about 70% of the time. I focused on purple and green when I could, but building red was so significantly easier to do that I had to go out of my way to use the other two colors. The system also means that once I start building any one color, I am more or less locked into it. The moment I put 2 or 3 points into one color, I stop paying attention to the other equipment I'd find of other colors, because no matter what, the damage output would be significantly lower, and if I tried to change the build mid-run, then whatever that build is would inherently be weaker because I had to change course. This is another reason I was stuck with red most of the time, because it gave me attack right at the start. So I built it, and once I cleared a few rooms and found weapons for other colors I might like to try, I still had to avoid them due to them being outside of my build. So in my opinion, Dead Cells really doesn't encourage you to play with all the toys and mix and match to find a build that best suits you, but instead to choose a color and hope you get good drops within that color. You could get a good drop for another color, but because you haven't been building that color, it's now really weak and basically useless. The last thing I can think of before getting into the individual areas is combat, generally speaking. Dead Cells has quite enjoyable combat. It was a little different than what I am used to in games, that being hitting the enemy while also taking hits and then recovering afterwards. In Dead Cells, you are pushed to get good at avoiding damage altogether. Sure, you can take some hits, but it doesn't recover automatically. You only have a certain number of potions, which can be upgraded to up to 4 per area. Without potions, you can't recover health unless you find food randomly along the course. And even when you have potions left over, you really don't want to get hit because it only takes 3 or 4 slaps about the face for most enemies to take you out. No matter what build I went with, it seemed the entire game was meant to make me exist as a glass cannon. The funny thing is, I don't usually like playing the tank. My ideal fighter is fast and hits like a ton of bricks. So one would think that Dead Cells leans into my preferred fighting style. Well, the answer to that would be yes, except it's a roguelike. I enjoy the fast and dangerous approach in most games, but usually it's when I can respawn. There's some sort of team objective like capture the flag, or else I'm fighting 1 or 2 enemies. But in Dead Cells, I have to get through an uncertain number of enemies for an uncertain amount of time while largely avoiding damage the whole time. This isn't to say it wasn't enjoyable. I found the combat to be quite fun, and it's because I had to approach it quite differently. Often my instinct when an enemy is about to attack is to pull back or take cover, but in Dead Cells, I'm pushed to be aggressive. Instead of baiting enemies to attack or waiting for them to finish their move, I was instead incentivized to kill the foe as quickly as possible and take them head on, heavily relying on dodges to avoid an attack if I messed up the timing. Parrying is also an option, and I tried it, but I've mentioned it in several videos before. I always forget to use a parry when I have one, even here in Dead Cells when I went out of my way to make a parrying build. I think in order for me to actually parry, a game has to take away my ability to dodge entirely. Now let's get into each of the zones. I don't know what the name of the place right outside of spawn is called, so we'll just call it the first level. This place was sometimes the most obnoxious one just because I ran into the most DLC content while here. Like I mentioned earlier, this meant I almost never completed the time challenge. The enemies were obviously the weakest in this place, so at the very least it was usually quite easy to complete the monster killing challenge. In some ways, this felt like the most impactful place to be, because whatever door you choose here had the largest impact on what the rest of the run would be like. Though maybe I'm wrong on that, because the doors afterwards tend to kind of funnel into the same place. My view could be a little distorted just because this is where I spent most of my time. This area also had places all over it that revealed I needed some sort of ability to get to some unknown location. This is good because I now know that there are abilities, but also frustrating because I know there's abilities and have no idea how to get them. Promenade at the Condemned is the door I most often found myself walking through after the first level. In all honesty, this one and the Ramparts felt the same to me, with the only difference being Rampart starts with you climbing a chain and has more holes where you can jump into the abyss. Both of them look quite similar, with Promenade feeling like it had more traps, but both of them also had holes to jump down and explore. Perhaps this is how it's meant to be though, as going through Promenade always led to Ramparts, and Ramparts looks like you're on the top of a castle or something, so perhaps Promenade is supposed to be the lower section of the castle or something? These were pretty easy levels, and I didn't often die in either of these locations unless I was being careless or performing particularly poorly. Most of the enemies are also the same as the ones in the starting area, with a few more thrown into the mix. These levels are also where a particular build is often solidified, and so the rest of the run is more a focus on survival and lucky drops as opposed to exploration. Or at least, that's how I ended up playing it. Instead of Promenade, I could also choose the other door, the Toxic Sewers. I hated the sewers and chose to avoid it as much as I could. Promenade had traps, sure, but they were spikes or spinny flails that you could easily tell were spikes, and plenty of room was given to avoid them. The sewers, however, had toxic water, and taking any damage at all, even from traps, could ruin a kill streak. The sewer water could be avoided easily enough, but the mere fact that it was a regular looking liquid meant that sometimes my mind just wouldn't read it as a threat, and there were also toxic pools you would have to avoid with much less space, making them more difficult to avoid than spikes. Sometimes it also felt as though I could spend more time in the toxic water than other times, so I never did get a good feel for how long I could actually be in the water. And this led to a feeling of being cheated after having pressed jump as soon as I had touched the water, like just skidding across the top, and I take damage sometimes, and sometimes I don't. So it felt inconsistent. There are lots of rats down here, and those are easy kills, but there's also scorpions that appear out of the ground without warning, and then there's these chunky boys that leave bombs behind after death to kill you. I often left the sewers and found myself in Ramparts, which is part of the reason I'm confused by Promenade and Ramparts being so similar. It took quite a while before I discovered that there was another door in the sewers that led to the ancient sewers, which I don't really need to talk about at length. It's just the toxic sewers on steroids. There's trapdoors that'll open moments after you touch them, and there are mushrooms that spawn spikes on the ground and these annoying tentacles. On the bright side, the chunky fellows would drop keys that would be used at the end of the room to unlock doors with loot behind them. It's as if the game admits this area is harder than the others. I'll get to the areas after the ancient sewers later, since I never went that direction. After Ramparts is the Black Bridge, where the concierge is waiting for you. Concierge? Whatever. This boss battle was never all that difficult, but at the same time, I could never quite get the hang of it. He's pretty easy until he's down to about a quarter of his health, and he'll start jumping at you, and it always caught me off guard. He also had an ability where he'll surround himself with a damaging aura, which was a little frustrating as it often meant I was standing around twiddling my thumbs due to only having close range weapons. This fight was never particularly satisfying, but not bad. The area after the Black Bridge, though, the Silt Village, is the most evil place in the entire game. There's this enemy who shoots cannonballs, and this enemy alone killed me more than anything else in the game. And I think the reason they are so painful to deal with is that they are the foil to the fighting style the game pushes you to play. The best strategy for me was to always charge at the enemy and kill them before they get off their first attack, but the cannoneer, without fail, shoots their cannonball the moment before you can lay a hand on them, and even if you do, this attack of theirs cannot be staggered. It will go off before you can kill them unless you are dealing stupidly high damage, and I rarely did. But even assuming you did strike first and they didn't shoot a cannon, they could still perform 3 consecutive close range attacks that also can't be staggered, and I'm fairly certain they launched the attack faster than most other enemies. Perhaps you should just dodge the cannonball and do a hit and run. Well, you can try, but the cannonball is not a simple dodge as it explodes when you get near it. This is all I have to say about Silt Village. These cannoneers are the absolute worst. I guess also them combined with these guys that spawn in little grubbies makes the whole thing much harder. The grubs aren't hard to kill, but they teleport to your location to attack, and with how fast they are spawned in, it was super easy to get surrounded by these things, and despite their size, they hurt. Assuming I made my way past Silt Village, the clock tower was what awaited me. The clock tower is most notable because there's several towers you can climb, and one has a key while another has the door you need the key for, and there's at least a million other towers to climb, or at least it felt that way. I often found myself stuck on this level for quite a long time because I couldn't find the tower with the key. I think this was just a me problem, but the key tower was always the last tower I found, and sometimes I was genuinely stuck because I thought I had explored all the towers and I had to carefully examine the map to see what I had missed. There's some different enemies here, including one who shoots a purple ball like some of the starter enemies, but this one explodes into 3 smaller exploding balls, and that was hard to dodge at times. These guys with purple swords were terrifying because they were the type of enemy who wasn't a big deal unless you got out of your rhythm, at which point they'd immediately end your run. When I finally escaped the clock room, I would come to the clock tower where there's a boss who every time I fought him, the battle would end, and I was like, oh wait, that's it? Each battle felt like it ended before I even knew what was going on. I couldn't even tell you much about the battle at all because I saw so little of it. From here, you go either to High Peak Castle or the derelict distillery. High Peak Castle is definitely the way to go. This is the room before the boss, so of course the enemies are quite strong here, but I loved how they looked and their attacks were well telegraphed. This didn't make them easy by any means, but at least it felt fair. I really liked High Peak Castle, but its counterpart, the distillery, was a whole different beast altogether. For one, there are kamikaze enemies, and I don't think anyone likes kamikaze enemies anywhere in any game. There are some in the sewers, but those ones require one hit to kill, so they're not that bad, but these ones have some health. They don't explode on impact, so that's good, but they were a menace. But it gets worse because there are explosive barrel traps and not the kind that sit still. These ones are bouncing all over the place, but these traps weren't enough for the creators because there's an enemy that adds more barrels to the mix. Too many explosives and ranged enemies, I never cleared this area. Because I want to save the boss for last, the next place I'll mention is the Ossuary. I don't know why, but I really enjoy the Ossuary. There was a skeleton sword guy who quite often ended my kill streaks, these weird slime spawning vile things, nose paths, and hedgehogs in the Ossuary. The skeletons and hedgehogs sucked, but I still think of the Ossuary fondly. I'm pretty sure it's only because it's the only place I ever got to use the Spartan sandals, and I quite enjoyed kicking enemies into walls or off ledges and one-shotting them like that. So yeah, that's gotta be it. That's why I love this place so much. The Insufferable Crypt is a boss room alternative to the Black Bridge, and I'm pretty sure the only way to it is through the toxic sewers. I had two fights in particular that seemed to illustrate my feelings on the boss pretty well. With the concierge, oh my goodness, no matter what build I had, I knew I could beat it, but with conjunctivius, I had one fight that felt balanced and another where I struggled to do anything at all. This boss was a much larger roadblock to progression and much more difficult than the concierge could have ever hoped to be, and I didn't see the rewards from it as being particularly better, so I saw little point in coming here except to mix things up, I guess. This meant I spent very little time in the Slumbering Sanctuary and the Graveyard. There might even be another door along this path, but I never found it. The Slumbering Sanctuary had several enemies that were a bit terrifying at first, but once I figured out their attacks, they weren't so bad. I did really enjoy though that you go through the level, push a button, and then you have to teleport back to the start of the level and make your way back to a door that was locked but is now open. It mixed up the formula a bit, and it shocked me when it first happened. The Graveyard I actually found to be remarkably easy and not much different than Promenade or Ramparts, just with different enemies. The only problem child in the Graveyard was this enemy wielding scythes, who I still don't quite understand how to dodge properly. At last, there's the bank, which was fun the first time and got me lots of loot, but it was also a long level that might as well be a side quest rather than a step in progression. I guess if I survived the bank, then I'd be much more well equipped for the battle ahead, but it took so long that I decided to just go without it. Though of course the danger it presented was a factor in that decision as well. And finally, there's the final boss in the throne room, where I have to fight the Hand of the King. I beat this guy first try and can honestly say I don't know how and that I don't know who he is or what he's like. All I do know is that I had this fireball attack that I found in High Peak Castle, which basically made me a firebender, and that carried me hard. Without that weapon, I would have definitely died to this boss, but because I did have it, the battle was over before I even knew it. I can't help but think I missed something at the end of the boss fight too, since there was some button, but I saw a button prompt and hit that before I saw the button, and that took me back to spawn. A door is also open just outside the starting area, and it says I need a DLC to access it. Apparently that DLC is free and is included in the base game for console, so I have no idea what's going on with it. Someone claimed the true boss is unlocked after this and is in this room or something, and I have to go down a path involving whatever, or something. I have no idea. I just knew I was satisfied and was done with the game. If I had to give Dead Cells a rating, it'd be a 6 out of 10. It was worth playing for a bit, but I'm not sure I'll ever return to it, and that's not really Dead Cells' fault per se. My rating is just my own personal opinion, and I'm not trying to be objective at all. Dead Cells had an upward battle from the start because I don't really enjoy roguelikes. I don't find repeating the same things over and over and over and over and over and over again to be particularly fun. The only way a game could convince me to do that is if its mechanics are just uniquely fun, and although Dead Cells had good mechanics, there was nothing I ever latched onto as particularly enjoyable. There were weapons that I loved, but there was no telling when or if I'd get them. I mentioned it at the start, so I'll talk about it here, but I have only ever liked one roguelike before, and it's called Wizards of Legend. I think there are 3 reasons why I loved that game, but Dead Cells didn't really click. For one, I found Wizards of Legend to have more fun, fast, and snappy combat. Not significantly more so, but enough to be noticeable. Secondly, beating the final boss in Wizards of Legend unlocked a new spell. In that game, you can have 4 spells on hand at any given time, similar to Dead Cells, and you unlock and purchase spells as you accrue money or beat the final boss. I had unlocked every spell in the game except for the special variant, the boss drops, and I was highly motivated to unlock the spells the boss drops. stopped. This brings me to the third reason I believed I enjoyed it more. And this reason is why I was highly motivated, and that is I got to choose 2 spells I started with every run. Rather than being forced into a game of chance as to what my starting weapon options will be and then continuing the game of chance as I played, I was allowed to pick 2 of my spells right from the get-go, and better yet, I was fully capable of keeping those spells over the course of the entire run. So if some spells had a good combo or I found them fun to use, then I could keep using them rather than having runs where I'm stuck fighting with weapons I don't enjoy or am bad at using. And that's what I would ask of all roguelikes. The combat has to be fun, of course, but also give me at least some amount of choice and make that choice matter. Also give me something to unlock, something that is permanent. The spells the final boss and Wizards of Legend drop could be immediately used by equipping them as my starting 2 spells, rather than waiting for them to eventually appear in a level. Dead Cells does this to an extent with the weapons you can unlock as you collect cells. I found myself filling up slots for weapons and equipment all the way to 1 so I could unlock them and use them mid-run if I so desired. The only problem with that is I didn't know for sure if I liked what I got and was often already pretty settled with what I had. I did use this to good effect at times, but there were also weapons that sat on 1 cell remaining for the entire time I played the game. So yeah, those are my thoughts on Dead Cells. Let me know what you think about the game and what you like or dislike about it. Be sure to subscribe and let me know if there are any games or roguelikes I should try next.